The morning sun caught the surface of Clearwater Creek perfectly, the way it had for 143 years. According to the county records that Marcus Webb would soon regret not reading. Sarah Chen stood on her back porch with her coffee, watching the water slip through the stones like liquid glass. Her daughter Emma had learned to skip rocks here when she was 4. Her late husband had proposed here 17 years ago on a Tuesday that felt like the whole world was breathing in rhythm with the creek. It was the kind of place that held history without demanding acknowledgement. Then, Marcus Webb bought the property directly, upstream. He was a tech executive, the type who acquired things the way other people collected achievements. 42 years old, divorced twice, recently relocated from Silicon Valley to escape what he called the noise. He'd paid cash for the estate property, 5 acres of carefully manicured land that sloped down toward the creek. The previous owners had loved that slope. They'd built a guest house with floor-to-ceiling windows angled toward the water. Marcus Webb saw something different. Within 2 weeks of closing, he'd hired contractors. Within 4 weeks, they'd begun construction on a barrier system, technically a water flow modification structure, according to the permits he'd somehow secured. To anyone with eyes, it was a wall. Concrete, 10 feet long, 3 feet high, designed to redirect the creek's natural course. Sarah first heard about it from her neighbor Tom, who worked in municipal planning and had the kind of connections that kept him informed about these things. He'd come to her door on a Thursday evening, his weathered face creased with concern. "They filed permits," Tom said, holding out his phone. "See? Commercial water management. Aesthetic enhancement to the property. Filed under his landscaping company." Sarah had stared at the words. Aesthetic enhancement. As if a creek was a piece of furniture to be repositioned for better feng shui. "That's insane," she'd said. "The creek's protected, isn't it?" Tom's expression had told her everything. It probably was. It probably wasn't. The answer lived in that gray space where money and paperwork did a complicated dance. She'd driven up to the property the next morning, no trespassing, but she'd parked on the road and walked along the tree line until she could see what they were building. The wall was already halfway complete. Workers in orange vests were mixing concrete while a man in a designer polo shirt, Marcus Webb himself, stood pointing and nodding, approving their work like he was commissioning a painting rather than altering the landscape. When he saw Sarah, he smiled. Actually smiled, like she was a neighbor coming to congratulate him on his new deck. "Morning," he called out. "Beautiful day. You're blocking the creek," Sarah said. "No hello, no pleasantries." The words came out sharp and specific. Marcus Webb's smile didn't falter. He walked over to the fence line, hands in his pockets, radiating the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no by a problem that money couldn't solve. "I'm managing the water flow," he said. "It was cutting right through the sight lines from my house. Now I'll have a beautiful water feature in a more strategic location. The creek will still flow. It's just going to be redirected through a culvert system. Much more elegant." "It's a creek," Sarah said. "Not a decoration." Everything's a decoration if you frame it right. Marcus Webb said this like it was philosophy. Like it was something he'd read in a business book. "Look, I understand you probably have some sentimental attachment to the natural flow pattern, but trust me, once you see how beautiful the new design is, you'll appreciate the upgrade." Sarah had turned and walked back to her car without another word, but her hands were shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home. That evening, she called Tom back. "I need to know everything about these permits," she said. Tom had whistled low. "It's going to get ugly." "Good," Sarah said. "I want it to." The next 3 weeks spiraled into a blur of research that consumed Sarah's life in a way she hadn't expected. She'd taken a leave from her job. She managed contracts for a logistics company, work that suddenly felt absurd in the context of a 100-year-old creek being channeled through plastic tubes. She started with the county assessor's office, pulling public records. The creek had official designation. It was part of the Whitman Creek system, which had minor protected status under state water rights ordinances. The designation wasn't ironclad. It allowed for reasonable modifications in support of residential landscaping. but it required environmental review, which Marcus Webb's permits seemed to have somehow bypassed. The landscaping company listed on the permits was registered to Marcus's ex-wife's maiden name. It had filed nothing but this single project in 6 years. It was a shell. Everyone could see it was a shell, but seeing it and proving it were different things. Sarah started knocking on doors. The neighborhood was 12 homes spread across 2 miles of creek frontage, far enough apart that people didn't always know each other, close enough that they shared the water. She'd spent 7 years building relationships on her street, bringing soup when people were sick, sitting with Tom's wife through her cancer treatment, helping coordinate the Christmas block party. Now she drew on every ounce of that goodwill. Tom answered immediately. He'd already filed a formal complaint with the County Planning Commission. His wife, Margaret, made copies of everything. David and Jennifer, the younger couple 2 houses down, attended the first unofficial meeting in Sarah's kitchen, bringing their own questions about whether the creek's rerouting would affect water pressure to their homes. By the 4th meeting, they had 11 households represented. By the 5th, they had a lawyer. His name was Marcus, too, which felt like cosmic joke, and he specialized in environmental law. He was expensive, but he'd agreed to a consultation after Sarah had explained the situation, after she'd shown him the maps and the permits and the photographs of the concrete wall now nearly complete. "This is actually strong," Marcus, the lawyer, had said, spreading papers across his desk. "The Water Rights Ordinance requires environmental impact assessment for any modification to protected waterways." He bypassed that. He got the permits under commercial landscaping, which shouldn't apply. "And look here," he'd pointed to a signature block. "He used a registered agent to file. That creates liability issues. So we can stop it?" Sarah had felt her chest expand with something like hope. "We can try," Marcus, the lawyer, said carefully. "We can file an injunction to halt construction while the permits are reviewed. But he's probably going to fight it. And he has money. Money buys patience and better lawyers. Money and better lawyers." The phrase had settled into Sarah's stomach like a stone. It was that stone, that sick certainty that the system was tilted, that had made Sarah do what she did next. She didn't just reach out to the neighbors anymore. She reached out to the town council. She reached out to the county extension office. She reached out to the local environmental groups, the water rights advocates, the Historical Preservation Society. She created a narrative. The creek wasn't just water, it was history, ecology, community. It was Emma's childhood. It was the place where the town's founders had first built a mill in 1881. It was a salmon run that was already struggling, and every disruption was another blow. It was hers. It belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to her. By the time Marcus Webb received the cease and desist letter from the environmental law firm representing the Clearwater Creek Preservation Coalition, a group that technically didn't exist yet but would, the wall was complete. 4 inches of protective concrete, redirecting water toward a culvert system that would have shunted it underground, away from the sight lines, away from the problem. The wall had been built in 11 days, and now, standing on her porch, Sarah could hear only the culvert's gurgle. The natural sound of the creek, that liquid conversation with stone, was gone. Marcus Webb had won. Or so he thought. Sarah set down her coffee cup with a deliberate clink. She pulled out her phone and dialed Tom. "Start calling people," she said. "It's time." The email arrived at Marcus Webb's office at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, forwarded through his property manager with a note. "You should probably look at this immediately." It was from an environmental law firm. 17 pages. Bold headers underlined facts he was reasonably certain had been private. The shell company registration, the bypassed environmental review, the protective creek designation his permits had technically violated. At the bottom, one line made him read it twice. Pursuant to the Whitman Creek Water Rights Statute, Reverend's Code, paragraph 4589, we hereby demand a cease and desist of all water modification construction and the removal of non-permissioned barriers within 30 days, pending environmental review and public hearing. Failure to comply will result in injunction proceedings. The letter was signed by Marcus Chen, environmental law specialist at Meridian Legal, The coalition's representative listed on the header was Sarah Chen. Sarah, the woman from the property line. The woman who'd said, "It's a creek," like it was profound. Marcus Webb did what rich people do when faced with problems. He called his lawyer. His lawyer's name was Richard Halstead, and he charged $600 an hour. He wore Hermes ties and had won 3 high-profile cases against environmental organizations. When Marcus explained the situation over the phone, Richard laughed. Actually laughed. "This is amateur hour," Richard said. "A cease and desist from some local environmental firm? They're trying to intimidate you. The permits you have are solid enough. Yes, technically there's some latitude in how the water rights statute is interpreted, but a reasonable modification for residential purposes, that's defensible." "But they're demanding I remove the barrier," Marcus said. "They're demanding a lot of things. What matters is what they can prove in court. And I'm telling you, this is not a strong case. This is someone upset about a wall in their neighbor's yard." By Wednesday morning, Marcus had convinced himself that Richard was right. This was theater. Community theater, performed by people who'd never faced real legal opposition. The letter had probably cost Sarah Chen everything her modest salary and savings could produce. So he was unprepared for what happened on Thursday. The Clearwater Creek Preservation Coalition held a press conference at the town hall, and somehow, they'd coordinated with 3 local news stations. Sarah stood at a podium with a printed packet of documents, flanked by Tom, who held a historical map showing the creek's original course, Jennifer, who held photographs of the barrier, and David, who held a map showing salmon migration patterns. The footage made the 6 o'clock news. For over 100 years, Clearwater Creek has been a vital part of our community's ecosystem and history, Sarah said, her voice steady, her hands holding the documents but her eyes locked on the camera. This week, a property owner made unauthorized modifications to this protected waterway, bypassing environmental review processes designed specifically to prevent this kind of disruption. She held up the cease and desist letter. "We're not anti-development. We're not anti-progress, but we are pro-transparency. We're pro-process, and we're pro-community. This isn't about one man's aesthetic preferences. It's about whether the law applies equally to everyone or whether a checkbook can make the rules." The news anchor cut to footage of the barrier. Then to Marcus Webb's empty driveway, the reporter adding narration, "We attempted to reach Mr. Webb for comment but received no response." By Friday morning, the story had migrated to social media. Neighbors who'd been passive became active. Neighbors who'd been active became vocal. The coalition's number doubled. A GoFundMe appeared, not to hire lawyers, but to support the environmental review process and hire an independent hydrologist. To assess the creek's condition, it raised $18,000 in 36 hours. Marcus Webb received the email about the hydrologist at his office. His hands had actually trembled as he forwarded it to Richard. "They're serious," he'd written. Richard responded within minutes. "They're annoying. Let me handle it." What Richard did was file a counter-motion arguing that the environmental review was unnecessary, that the modification was minor enough to fall under standard residential exception clauses, and that the Preservation Coalition had no standing to bring a suit on behalf of a creek. It was legally sound. It was also aggressive enough to feel like provocation. Sarah received the counter-motion via email at 11 p.m. on Saturday. She was sitting in her kitchen, the kitchen where she'd held the first coalition meeting 3 weeks earlier, when she read the language. Frivolous complaint, harassment by neighborhood coalition, reasonable and permitted modification. She made a decision that night. She didn't sleep. Instead, she spent 12 hours compiling a document that would change everything. She pulled permits from the county archives. She pulled property tax records. She pulled, through a contact at the water department, the actual water usage records for the previous owners of Marcus Webb's property, showing they'd never needed to redirect the creek because they'd never had a problem with it. Then she found something else. Something that Richard Halstead and Marcus Webb probably didn't know existed, a 1987 covenant. A line in the original property deed, nearly 40 years old, that specifically designated the creek as a natural waterway easement and prohibited substantial modifications to water flow or course, without consent of downstream property holders. The previous owners hadn't modified the creek because they'd been legally prohibited from doing so, and that covenant had probably transferred to the current deed. Marcus Webb had almost certainly voided his own permits the moment he'd built the barrier. Sarah forwarded this finding to Marcus Chen, the lawyer, with a subject line, "This changes everything." The lawyer's response came at 6 a.m. "Call me." The press conference happened on Monday morning. This time, the video went viral. Not local news viral, national viral. "Property owner ignores covenant, faces legal action from neighbors" became the headline. News outlets started calling it Creek Gate. Twitter started offering opinions. A Reddit thread hit 40,000 comments, and in the middle of it all, Marcus Webb realized something. He'd miscalculated. He'd thought this was about a creek and a woman with good intentions but limited resources. He'd been wrong. It was about something much more dangerous than that. It was about a community that had been asked to watch and had decided to fight instead. Marcus Webb's lawyer called him on Tuesday morning with a single piece of advice. "We need to talk about settlement." The confidence had drained from Richard Halstead's voice, literally drained, like someone had opened a valve. Marcus held the phone while his expensive lawyer explained that the covenant discovery had fundamentally changed the case's trajectory, that going to trial now would be expensive and possibly pointless, that judges tended to look unfavorably on homeowners who violated their own deed restrictions. "But I didn't know about the covenant," Marcus had protested. "You should have known," Richard had said flatly. "That's what title insurance is for. That's what due diligence is for. The fact that you didn't do it doesn't change the fact that you violated it." Marcus hung up the phone and sat in his office, the office in his perfectly designed home with the perfectly landscaped yard and the perfectly positioned creek, currently flowing through a concrete culvert somewhere beneath the surface, and felt the first real pulse of fear. He called Sarah Chen. She answered on the third ring, like she'd been expecting his call. "We should talk," he said. "We should," Sarah agreed. They met at a coffee shop in town, neutral territory, carefully chosen by both sides. Sarah arrived with Tom. Marcus arrived with his lawyer, Richard. The visual contrast was immediately apparent. Sarah's team was worn and tired but resolved. Marcus's team was polished and anxious. "My client is willing to discuss removing the barrier structure," Richard began before anyone had sat down, "in exchange for a full release of any claims, dismissal of the lawsuit, and agreement not to file any additional proceedings. Your client violated a deed covenant," Marcus Chen, Sarah's lawyer, replied. "The barrier stays removed. Additionally, your client will fund restoration of the creek to its original state and cover all environmental assessment costs." "That could run into 6 figures, Richard said. "Yes," Sarah's lawyer said. "We're aware." Marcus Webb was listening to lawyers negotiate over money when he should have been listening to the actual problem. He interrupted. "Why is this happening?" he asked Sarah directly. She blinked. "What? Why do you care this much?" "It's a creek. I'm offering to fix it. I'll remove the barrier. Why does that not solve it?" Sarah set down her coffee with deliberate care. "Because you didn't ask permission," she said. "Because you looked at something that didn't belong to you and decided it was yours to rearrange. Because the only reason you're here now, the only reason we're having this conversation, is because enough people said no that you couldn't ignore them anymore, not because you suddenly understood what you'd done." "I made a mistake," Marcus said. "You made a choice," Sarah corrected. "You chose to do something you knew was questionable because you didn't expect anyone would have the resources or coordination to stop you. And you were right. If I'd been alone, you would have won. The wall would still be there. The creek would still be rerouted. I'd be sitting on my porch listening to a culvert, and you'd be sitting on yours admiring your view." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. A recognition, maybe, of a truth he'd been avoiding. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to remove the barrier," Sarah said. "I want you to restore the creek. And I want you to understand why this matters, not because you lost a legal battle, but because you actually understand it." It was an impossible ask. Understanding couldn't be forced. Empathy couldn't be negotiated into existence, but sometimes, rarely, but sometimes when someone is confronted with their own choices starkly enough, something shifts. Marcus Webb agreed to remove the barrier. He agreed to hire an environmental restoration company to repair the creek bed. He agreed to fund the assessment costs. He agreed to all of it, perhaps because resisting further was futile, or perhaps because Sarah's words had actually landed somewhere real inside him. The removal took 3 days. Heavy equipment arrived on Wednesday morning. By Thursday evening, the barrier was gone. The creek flowed freely again on Friday morning. Sarah stood on her porch, the same porch where she'd stood a month earlier, watching the creek with the casual certainty that it would always be there, and felt the weight of a month's exhaustion settle into her bones like sediment. Tom appeared beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. "We did it," he said. "We did," Sarah agreed. But as she listened to the creek resuming its voice, finding its rhythm again, she realized something uncomfortable. Winning didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. She'd expected vindication. She'd gotten resolution instead. The barrier was gone. The creek was flowing. The community had unified and triumphed. But Marcus Webb still lived upstream. And on Saturday morning, Sarah got a call from Jennifer. "Have you seen the news?" Jennifer asked. Sarah hadn't. She pulled up the local news website on her laptop. The headline made her stomach drop. Environmental Executive Marcus Webb faces additional scrutiny. EPA launches investigation into prior development projects. The article was sparse on details but rich in implication. Apparently, someone, the article didn't say who, had sent documentation to the EPA regarding Mr. Webb's prior development projects in California, suggesting a pattern of environmental violations and permit bypassing. The EPA, which took such things seriously, had launched a preliminary investigation. Sarah's hands felt numb as she scrolled through the article. She hadn't done this. Her coalition hadn't done this. But someone had. And then at the bottom of the article, a single line that made everything shift. Mr. Webb's ex-wife, Patricia Webb, filed a statement with the EPA expressing concerns about environmental damage at properties her ex-husband developed during their marriage. Patricia, his ex-wife, the woman whose company name had been used to register the shell business that had created this entire problem. Sarah called her lawyer immediately. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "About the EPA investigation?" "No," Marcus Chen said, and she believed him. "About Patricia Webb?" "Yes, she reached out to me 2 weeks ago. She wanted to know what was happening here. I told her the situation. Apparently, she decided to use that information." Is that retaliation?" Sarah asked. "It's due diligence," the lawyer replied. She reported legitimate concerns. Whether those concerns are connected to this particular situation is, from a legal standpoint, irrelevant. They're valid concerns. The EPA is required to investigate. Sarah hung up the phone. She'd won. The creek was flowing. The coalition had triumphed. Justice had been served. So why did it feel like they'd opened a door they didn't know how to close? The EPA investigation snowballed in a way that nobody, least of all Sarah Chen, had anticipated. It started with the projects in California. 3 properties developed by Marcus Webb's company over the past 15 years, each with some variation on the same problem: water modification without proper permits, environmental assessments conducted by shell consulting firms, violations of local ordinances buried under layers of corporate structure. One project had involved draining a wetland. Another had diverted a seasonal stream. The third had created an artificial pond that displaced native species. Each violation had been relatively small. Individually, they might have been defensible under various technicalities. Collectively, they told a story of pattern and practice. By the 3rd week of October, Marcus Webb had been named in a preliminary enforcement action. By the 4th week, his company faced fines exceeding $2 million. By early November, his investors, who'd pumped capital into development projects across 3 states, had started pulling out. Sarah watched this unfold from her porch, her creek flowing freely beside her, and felt something tightening in her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She'd asked for the barrier to be removed. She'd wanted the creek restored. She hadn't wanted Marcus Webb's entire professional history to be excavated and examined and judged wanting. Tom found her sitting on her front steps one morning, staring at nothing in particular. "You okay?" he asked. "Is it justice?" Sarah asked him. "What happened to Marcus Webb? Is it justice or is it just revenge wearing a justice-colored coat?" Tom sat down beside her. "What do you want it to be?" he asked. Sarah didn't have an answer for that. What she did have was a phone call on Thursday morning. Marcus Webb asking if they could meet again. They met at the same coffee shop. This time, Marcus came alone. No lawyer. He looked diminished, not physically, but in some essential way, as if the weight of consequences had compressed him into a smaller version of himself. "I wanted you to know," he said carefully, "that I didn't ask for the EPA investigation." "I know," Sarah said. "It was your ex-wife." "Patricia," he said, and there was a sadness in his voice that Sarah hadn't expected. "She was always more thorough than I was, more honest. That's partly why we ended. She couldn't tolerate what I was doing. What I'd been doing for years, apparently." He wrapped his hands around a coffee mug he didn't drink from. "Do you know how many violations they're claiming?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. 27, Marcus said. "Across all the projects. I didn't even know about most of them. My teams filed them, my company processed them, and I signed off. I was making quarterly calls and signing documents, assuming everyone was following protocol. But apparently protocol was whatever got the project done fastest." He looked at Sarah with eyes that held genuine pain. "I destroyed a lot of things," he said, "and I never thought about it because I never had to see the destroyed things. They were in different states, different regions, abstract consequences for abstract violations. But here," he gestured vaguely toward the creek, toward Sarah's neighborhood, toward all the places where his carelessness had manifested tangibly. "Here I had to look at what I'd done, and it was real. The creek was real. Your community was real. And now your life is becoming real," Sarah said quietly. "The consequences are actual instead of abstract." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "And I don't know how to explain this, but I'm almost grateful for that. Not for the EPA investigation, not for losing my company, but for having to see what I'd done, for having someone care enough to make me see it." Sarah felt something in her crack open, a place where righteousness and empathy had to negotiate with each other. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What can I do?" Marcus said. "Pay the fines. Cooperate with the investigation. Possibly face criminal charges, depending on how deeply they want to pursue it. Sell this house. I don't think I can stay here, honestly. Too many reminders of what I've become." He stood up. "I just wanted you to know that you were right," he said. "About everything. About how this matters. About why one person caring enough to fight is enough to change systems. You didn't destroy my life, Sarah. I did. You just made me see it. And that matters." He left the coffee shop without waiting for a response. Sarah sat alone, with her coffee and the weight of what justice actually looked like when you had to live in the same town with the person you'd extracted it from. The celebration happened anyway. The community held a gathering on the creek bank 3 weeks. Later, a small ceremony marking the successful restoration. There were maybe 50 people, coalition members, local officials, environmental advocates, families who'd simply heard about the effort and wanted to be part of marking its completion. Sarah stood beside the creek with a glass of cider, watching Emma, now 12 and not skipping stones but close, wade in the shallow water, looking for rocks that might have been disturbed during the restoration. The hydrologist who'd been hired for the environmental assessment gave a brief talk about how well the creek was recovering, how the fish populations were already beginning to stabilize, how the restoration work had been so thorough that you'd barely know anything had been different. "This is what community action looks like," the hydrologist said. "This is what happens when people care enough to show up and fight for something that matters." Everyone applauded. Sarah applauded too. But as she watched the ceremony, she felt oddly hollow. The creek was restored. The barrier was gone. Justice had been served, but it had also cost more than she'd planned to pay. Her lawyer had sent her an invoice for $12,000. The GoFundMe had covered $9,000 of it, and Sarah had written a check for the rest. Her leave from work had turned into a resignation. She'd used up her emotional reserves and decided not to return to the logistics company. She'd taken a part-time position at the local environmental nonprofit instead, working for a fraction of what she'd been earning. The coalition had also fragmented. The urgency that had bound them together had dissipated once the barrier was removed. Some people had moved on. Others, like Tom and Jennifer, had become genuine friends. Others had simply returned to their lives, the community action becoming a story they told at dinner parties rather than a continuous commitment. And Marcus Webb had sold his house. The sale had closed 2 weeks earlier. He'd taken a significant loss, selling a month ago rather than waiting for the market to correct. His ex-wife had apparently found a consulting firm, and Marcus was rumored to be considering a career change, something in environmental remediation, which felt like poetic irony or genuine redemption depending on how cynical you were feeling. Sarah didn't know which it was. What she did know was that she'd gotten what she wanted. The creek flowed. The community had unified. The system had been forced to acknowledge a violation and demand restoration. But victory, she was learning, was complicated. 6 months later, Sarah found a letter in her mailbox, actual physical mail, which had become rare enough to feel significant. It was from Marcus Webb. He'd mailed it from an address in Portland, Oregon. Sarah, it read, I wanted to reach out one more time, to thank you for what you did and also to apologize for what you had to do it against. I've spent the last half-year learning about environmental restoration. It turns out that destruction is much faster than repair. A year of carelessness can require a decade of work to correct. I've started volunteering with an environmental nonprofit here in Portland, helping to restore wetlands that were developed improperly in the 1990s. The work is hard and specific and thankless, and I find that I'm finally good at something because I actually care about the outcome. I wanted to tell you something I've come to understand. I blamed you for the EPA investigation. I blamed your coalition for escalating what should have been a simple neighborhood dispute. But I was the one who escalated it. I escalated it the moment I decided a creek was something I could own and reshape. You just had the courage to say no. Most people don't have that courage. Most people see something wrong and assume it's not their responsibility to fix it. You saw something wrong and spent weeks of your life, months really, fighting to restore it. That's extraordinary. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect we'll ever be friends. But I wanted you to know that I'm finally starting to become someone I'm not ashamed to be. Thank you for making me see that I needed to change. Marcus. Sarah read the letter twice, then 3 times. She showed it to Tom, who was over for dinner with Margaret. He sounds different, Margaret observed. Genuinely different. Or genuinely good at sounding like he's learned something, Tom offered, ever pragmatic. It's hard to tell with people. Yeah, Sarah agreed. It is, but she kept the letter anyway. She filed it in a folder with the court documents and the coalition meeting minutes and the photographs of the creek restoration. The documentation of a moment when a community had organized and fought and won, the environmental nonprofit where Sarah now worked full-time, a position that had opened after the creek victory had raised the organization's profile. Significantly, was planning a major initiative around water, protection and community involvement. The board had asked Sarah to lead it. She'd accepted, but with a caveat. She wanted it to be about systemic change, not individual heroics. She wanted it to be about building structures that would catch the next Marcus Webb before he became a problem, rather than relying on community coalitions to fight battles they shouldn't have to fight. The system should work, she'd told the board, not because of the people who care enough to fight. It should work because it's designed to work. The board had agreed. They'd funded her position for 2 years to develop policy recommendations. Emma, meanwhile, had started a school project about water rights and community activism, using the creek crisis as her case study. She'd interviewed Sarah, Tom, Jennifer, David, and even, through email, Marcus Webb himself. Her conclusion, written in the overwrought style of a talented 12-year-old, was this: justice isn't just about winning. It's about making sure the problem doesn't happen again. Marcus Webb blocking the creek was bad. But people who watch problems happen and do nothing are just as bad. Sarah's coalition didn't just stop Marcus Webb. They showed other people that if they see something wrong, they can do something about it. That's the real victory. Not that Marcus lost, but that everyone learned they had power. Sarah had read that conclusion and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but something like purpose. She'd fought for a creek, but Emma had extracted the real lesson. Power comes when people realize they have it. The creek ceremony happened annually, every year, on the date of the successful restoration. It had become a minor local tradition. Families would gather, environmental groups would give talks, and the community would celebrate together. On the third anniversary, Sarah was standing at the creek bank when Jennifer rushed toward her, looking flustered. "Sarah, you need to come see this," Jennifer said. Sarah followed her upstream, toward the property where Marcus Webb's house had been. It had been purchased by a family 6 months earlier, the Rodriguezes, who had 3 children and a genuine love of creek habitats. What they'd done was restore the property to a more natural state. They'd removed the ornamental landscaping. They'd planted native species. They'd created a small restoration project that worked with the creek's natural flow rather than fighting it. "They asked me to tell you about it," Jennifer said. "They're new to the area, so they didn't experience the conflict. But they heard about it, and they decided to make their property part of the solution. They're working with the environmental nonprofit to study native species recovery." Sarah looked at the property, the way the creek flowed freely, the way native plants were beginning to establish themselves, the way the landscape was healing. And she realized something. The story wasn't about Marcus Webb at all. It wasn't even really about the creek, though the creek mattered. It was about what happened when people decided that their community was worth fighting for and then continued to build on that fight even after the crisis had passed. The Rodriguezes came down to meet her. They were warm and genuine and had no agenda except wanting to do something positive with their land. They'd created something beautiful, not because they'd been forced to, but because someone else's fight had opened their eyes to what was possible. "Your creek is special," the mother, Isabella, said to Sarah. "We wanted to be part of taking care of it." And that, Sarah thought, was the real victory. 2 years after Marcus Webb moved to Portland, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the nonprofit office. It was him. He looked different, slimmer, less polished, wearing a flannel shirt that seemed genuine rather than curated. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but they were laugh lines rather than tension lines. "I'm in town for a conference," Marcus said when Sarah came out to greet him. "Environmental Restoration Conference. I'm actually presenting now, on rehabilitation of improperly developed sites." He waited for Sarah to respond, and when she didn't immediately, he continued, "I wanted to come see the creek, and I wanted to see how you were doing. I've kept track, through news articles and your nonprofit's website. You've done good work." They walked to the creek together, neither speaking until they reached the place where the barrier had once stood. The creek flowed freely, and salmon were beginning to return. The restoration had been so successful that it was becoming a case study for other communities. "I was wrong," Marcus said without preamble. "I was wrong about everything. About the creek being mine to reshape, about assuming that money could solve problems, about not asking permission or considering consequences. I know I've said this before, but I needed to say it again here, where it happened." Sarah watched the water flow over smooth stones. "I've asked myself 1,000 times," Marcus continued, "what would have happened if you hadn't fought? If you'd just let me build my wall and redirect my creek and ruin my view the way I wanted, I would have probably done the same thing to 5 more properties, 10 more. I had no reason to stop." "But I did fight," Sarah said quietly. "You did," Marcus agreed, "and that changed everything. For me, for the creek, for your community. It changed systems. Look at the environmental review process now. It's more robust. The county updated its ordinances specifically because of what happened here. You didn't just stop one wall. You prevented future walls." He turned to face her directly. "I came here to tell you that I understand now why you did what you did, and why you did it so thoroughly, not just removing the barrier, but also fighting the system, and also continuing to work on prevention. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure this doesn't happen again. Does that change anything for you? Sarah asked. Knowing that understanding comes after all the consequences. Marcus smiled sadly. No, he said. I'm still facing fines. My reputation is still destroyed. My career as a developer is definitely over. But I'm building a different life now, one where I'm actually trying to repair things rather than just creating them. And if that's the consequence of finally understanding what I should have understood in the first place, then I'll take it. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. I wanted to give this to your nonprofit, he said. It's the remainder of my settlement from the EPA case, the money they didn't require me to pay in fines. I've been living modestly in Portland, and I realized I don't need it. Your organization's water protection initiative is exactly the kind of work that should have existed when I was building in California. If it had, maybe I would have become someone different. Sarah opened the envelope. The check was for $200,000. Marcus, I can't— You can, he interrupted gently. You can and you should. Not because it absolves me. Nothing absolves me. But because that money can do real good. And keeping it does no one any good. Let it help prevent the next Marcus Webb. Let it help communities fight the next wall before it gets built. Sarah held the check, feeling its weight. I have one question, she said. Do you actually believe you've changed? Or are you just good at saying what people want to hear? It was a brutal question, and Marcus took his time answering it. I don't know, he finally said. Genuinely, I don't know. I think I'm different. But I also know that people are self-deceptive. I think I care about this work now, but I also know that caring feels good and that it's possible I'm just chasing the feeling rather than the substance. What I do know is that I'm trying. I'm trying harder than I've ever tried at anything. And I'm staying in a place, professionally, geographically, emotionally, where if I start to slip back, someone will call me out on it. He glanced back toward the creek. The creek keeps me honest, he said. Every time I'm tempted to think I've done enough, I think about this creek, about how it's still recovering, about how long restoration takes compared to destruction. That keeps me from backsliding. Sarah nodded slowly. That's probably all any of us can do, she said. The documentary that eventually got made about the creek. Crisis was called One Woman Against the Wall by a filmmaker who'd heard the story and recognized its broader significance. It premiered at a local film festival 2 years later, and both Sarah and Marcus attended, though they didn't sit together, and they barely acknowledged each other afterward. But the documentary did exactly what Sarah had hoped it would do. It showed other communities that they had power. It demonstrated what organized neighbors could accomplish. It provided a roadmap for fighting systems that seemed immovable. Within 6 months of the premiere, 17 similar cases had been initiated by communities inspired by the Creek Coalition's success. 5 of them had already won, restoring waterways that had been illegally modified or damaged. Sarah's water protection initiative expanded. She hired a staff of 6 people. She began consulting with communities across the state. She developed curriculum that taught environmental law to ordinary people. She created a network of volunteer legal advisors who could help communities fight battles they shouldn't have to fight, but would anyway if no one else helped. Emma, now in high school, had started a student environmental advocacy club. The first project they took on was helping a community 2 towns over fight a similar creek diversion. They used Sarah's materials. They organized like they'd learned from watching their mother. They won, and Marcus Webb in Portland continued his quiet work of restoration. He'd published a paper on the psychological mechanisms that allow people to justify environmental destruction. He'd helped develop training programs for environmental managers, teaching ethical project development. He was never going to be famous, and he was never going to be absolved, but he was building something that mattered. On the 10th anniversary of the wall's removal, the community held a major celebration. Sarah was invited to speak. So was Marcus. He drove down from Portland for the event. He stood in front of the crowd, which had grown to nearly 300 people, and talked about being the villain in someone else's story. Sarah didn't defeat me, he told the crowd. I defeated myself. I did something I knew was questionable because I didn't think about consequences. And then I lived in a community where my consequences were real and visible and impossible to ignore. That's the kindness the universe sometimes offers. the chance to see what you've actually done. He stepped aside and Sarah came forward. She didn't talk about winning. She talked about continuing. The creek is restored, she said, but it will need protecting, always. The systems that should have prevented this will need to be maintained and improved. The community that came together will need to stay vigilant. Victory isn't an endpoint. It's a starting point. It's when you understand that you have power, and that power is something you have to use carefully and continuously. She looked out at the crowd, at Tom and Margaret, at Jennifer and David, at Emma, at Isabella Rodriguez and her family, at Marcus Webb standing at the back, listening. The real story isn't about a creek or a wall or one man's poor choices, Sarah said. It's about what happens when ordinary people realize that they matter, that their voice matters, that their community matters enough to fight for. Once you understand that, you can't unknow it, and you can't stop. You become part of something bigger than yourself, and that's not a burden. That's grace. The creek flows freely still. The salmon run is stabilized. Native species have returned. Sarah Chen runs an organization that's expanded beyond the region, teaching community organizing and environmental justice to hundreds of people. Marcus Webb works for an environmental remediation company, leading projects that repair damage others created. The irony not lost on anyone. Emma is in college, studying environmental policy, determined to build systems that catch problems before they become crises. Tom and Margaret volunteer with the nonprofit. Jennifer and David have started a community garden along the creek bank. The barrier is gone, but the lesson remains. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, Sarah stands on her porch and listens to the creek speak. It sounds like water finding its way around stones, like fish jumping, like the planet remembering how to heal. It sounds like justice, not as punishment, but as restoration. It sounds like home.